So, sitting down with us today, we have Jeff Gould, who is a former youth sport tennis player at Brock University and is now working with the Canadian Olympic Committee. Jeff, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, so obviously, insane year for everybody, right? Sports is definitely not immune to all the other things that are going on in the world and all that. How has even just your day to day sort of job at the Canadian Olympic Committee changed now that we're in all these lockdowns and altered schedules and everything?
Well, it's different for sure. Like even at the beginning when we weren't sure if the original games were getting canceled or not, you sort of do your job while trying to think, well, is this worth it? Is this going to amount to anything? And like my job specifically, I work a lot with how our athletes qualify and the pathways that they take and the competitions that they have to compete in order to get spots at the games. And so with the postponement of those games right from the bat, all of these competitions with COVID were getting canceled and qualification competitions were being moved. And now we've got some even going as late as June, July for like a late July Olympic Games start, which means some people don't know if they've qualified until 2 weeks before the games.
Which is wild when you think about it, right? So like
Yeah.
normally this is something you're training for years for, and here you are, you're not knowing whether you're going to be hopping on a plane in 2 weeks, a couple days before you could be actually competing for a medal, right?
Exactly. And some people have retired because of this. Other people have now come into the mix of possible athletes because that one extra year of youth and sort of development has given them the chance now. So it's definitely a lot of moving parts on who's going to go and who's not going to go.
Yeah, yeah. And I would assume that it's probably dependent on what sport they're, sort of competing in, and each one is probably different. But what sort of was the COC's stance on, obviously you had all these people qualify already, they were ready to go for Tokyo 2020. Now it's delayed. Are they mostly just rolling over, if you qualified for 2020, you automatically are in for this postponed game, or are they like requalifying and holding some sort of virtual meets and whatnot, or is it really on a case by case basis depending on what sport it is?
So the way that it works from the IOC itself is basically any quota spots that have been qualified before are still valid now. I think in some sports they've added a couple extra spots just to sort of, I guess, balance out what's happened. Us in particular, we've basically decided that the spots that were given to teams, no one's been picked yet in terms of like what are the 12, 13, whatever team size you have on who's actually going for that. And that won't be decided until probably a couple months before. But in terms of any individuals that qualified by name, so I'm talking about sports like sport climbing or some of the smaller, more individual sports where the people have qualified the spots themselves and not just for the country of Canada, those people have been honored their spots by the COC, and so they will automatically still be going to the games.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, lots of moving parts going on here, but being a former high-level athlete yourself, right? You were probably used to competing on some fairly large stages and some large events and all of that. When you first started your position, was it a little bit eye-opening to see just how much work goes into sort of the behind-the-scenes stuff to put on these large-scale events? Like, what was the biggest learning curve for you in, say, your first 6 months on the job?
I think it was definitely different for sure. I had known a little bit about some of the stuff that goes behind the scenes because I was doing a Bachelor of Sport Management at the same time. And
Mhm.
so we were sort of learning about this stuff. And as I was competing at these different tournaments, you sort of start to notice it. But it's a whole nother level when you get to an organization that's as big as the COC and you see that these all these different people are planning for not only the 400 athletes that might go to a games like Tokyo, but there are thousands of potential athletes and coaches that are on the list. And so you're planning anything from who's going to what accreditation are they going to have, travel, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I got to the job, it's a lot of learn as you go and sort of just as long as you can work hard and pump out results and ask a lot of questions, you're good to go. But you can't ever expect to get into a job like this and know what you're doing because there's no way. It doesn't matter sort of how high of an athlete you were. And we have Olympians working for us that still didn't understand the behind the scenes, even though they went to games until they actually got to the organization and started working on the back end of things.
Yeah, yeah. Does any one or two moments in particular stand out for you where, you were maybe helping to run an event and it was just like, wow, I had no idea that, this was what went into pulling off this aspect of it. Like, does anything sort of stick out in your memory from those early days?
There are a couple. When I was, because I started as an intern before I got a job at the CSC, and so I was interning with our games team, specifically with outfitting.
Hmm.
And one thing that definitely stood out to me is in terms of outfitting, they have to order the amount of clothing in the sizes that they want 2 years before the games actually
Oh,
happen.
geez.
So they're using all this past data and expectations and whatever and trying to predict what sizing and how much stuff they're going to need for 2 years down the road, which I looked at that and I was like, I don't know how you guys came up with this algorithm on how to figure this out and how this all came to be, but that was definitely one of the craziest parts.
Yeah.
The crazy part when I got my job basically is I deal a lot with the registration of our different athletes and coaches and everybody to the organizing committee. So that's submitting their data in advance just so they know who could possibly be coming, who they have to make these accreditation passes for, and all of that. And I didn't realize the magnitude of that you were basically registering and vetting data and making sure everything was okay for thousands and thousands of different people. And you don't realize it, but it's crazy to see how many people are potentials and how much even the sports themselves have to go through trying to vet on who is possibly going to go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean that's sort of an interesting point that you just brought up there too, because unless you were, fairly high in the sports system, a former Olympian yourself, doing a sports management degree, something like that, where some of these things you would sort of intuitively know or at least be aware of. For a large portion of the public, like they genuinely have no idea how many moving parts are going on behind the scenes to pull off an event as global and as huge as an Olympic Games. So, like, how do you even begin to describe the amount of moving targets and deadlines and all of that, and the show around the show that goes into pulling off an Olympic event? Because some people might be saying like, okay, well, so what's Tokyo? It's still in Tokyo. They just delayed it a year, but it has much larger effects than that, right? Like, how do you
Yeah.
even begin to describe sort of everything that goes into pulling that off?
I just think it's a ton of collaboration between a bunch of people that have a sport background, but more so are extremely organized and deliberate in what they do. And sort of everything that anybody does has to be coordinated with other people. And so we use project management tools and a lot of meetings and stuff like that. But still, to be able to put it all together requires a ton of detail and collaboration for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, obviously it's supposed to have Tokyo 2020. It's been delayed till 2021. That's, fingers crossed, knock on every piece of wood we've got here that things go well and we can actually pull it off this year. But, what was the initial reaction maybe from even just the athletes that you guys are working with when the announcement was formally made that, what, we're not doing it in 2020, we're delaying it a full year? Was it mostly a sense of relief that, okay, I didn't really want to put myself through all of these crazy safety protocols of that? Was it disappointment because, like you said, maybe even a couple of them retired, this was going to be their final games? Like, what was sort of just the general census from the athletes?
Well, I think it was pretty mixed. And just so like because I'm not sure if even you're aware, but before the Olympic organization in Japan as well as the IOC decided to cancel the games, we actually came out and said even if the games happen, we're not sending anybody because of the risks that are there.
Hmm.
So at least our athletes sort of had that day or two ahead of everyone else. But there was a lot of disappointment. There were quite a few athletes that came out to at the very beginning and sort of were a little upset at the COC as an organization and why we did it before they got canceled as a whole because they didn't really understand the severity of this pandemic at the time. Because when that happened in I think it was March or April, it wasn't as bad as we started to sort of see coming in the months after that. But I think there was a lot of disappointment in the fact that people didn't know what to do because when you're at that high level, there are your planning phases that you sort of map out with your team on when are your peak periods, when am I ramping up my training, my competition. So when you plan all of that and you put all of your money and resources into that, and then you have to sort of try to backtrack and see, okay, how do I replan for another year down the road? It takes a lot on certain athletes for sure. But again, on the other side of it, there were a lot of athletes that were understanding and backed our position and saw that we were sort of taking a world lead on keeping our athletes safe. So
Mhm.
I think there were sort of both sides of the argument there.
Yeah, yeah. And you just brought up a fairly interesting point there as well too, just about routines and whatnot. And I mean, you could probably speak to it as well too. When you were an athlete and competing at the university level, there, you get into a routine, right? You've got your weightlifting days, you've got your training, your practice routine. Okay, I'm going to go do this. Da, da. You've got it all mapped out well in advance. It's not a roll out of bed and let's see where the day takes me style mentality by any stretch of the imagination. So here we are now in a setting where we've got gyms and facilities and all sorts of, training components that are just shut down and aren't accessible for a lot of the athletes, right? How do you think, them almost needing to train virtually with their coaches or at home or outdoors in modified spaces, how do you think that's going to actually affect their, I guess, in competition performance? Like, should we expect less world records and Olympic time records getting broken at these games, or do you think it's still going to be pretty well, the same performance athletically at least?
I think it depends on the sport you're talking about. Like a lot of athletes have been able to try and create these home gyms to sort of go through and try and keep their times up or whatever it is. And I think that you might very well see a dip in a lot of certain scores, especially in something like athletics, where your times and your heights and your whatever it is. But um, a lot of the different athletes now have found ways to still get out of country for certain competitions that are still happening, or they've gone to other parts of the world where they've been able to train. And so those athletes, I think, still will be able to hold their own. I think all of our athletes will still be able to hold their own, but again, like you can have weights and as much as you want in your garage in a home gym, but it's very different than having all of the resources that you'd get at a high performance gym facility.
Right, right. So I mean, how far out does the COC begin actually planning for an Olympic cycle? Is it, 4 full years? Is it about two, like you were saying with the ordering of clothing and whatnot, there's it about 2 years out, or are they looking like 8 years in advance with some of these high performance athletes? Like what's sort of the training and the planning logistics cycle for you guys there?
So usually for us, we go by quads basically. So we'll start 4 years out and basically 4 years between each of the summer games and then a winter game in between. But there are certain things where the winters will have their own quads from a winter game to a winter game. And it's funny because a lot of the time I'll get people that ask me, what do you do when there's not Olympic games? Do you just not do anything? And they don't actually realize all the planning that has to go in from budgeting to whatever else that far out. And people also don't know that basically we do summer and winter Olympics, but we also do the logistics to send our teams to the youth Olympic Games and the youth Winter Olympic Games, as well as Pan Am Games too. So even in these next couple of years, we've got two in 2021, two, or now it's one in 2022, and then another one in 2023, and then two in 2024. So the next span of 4 years, it's something like 7 games that people don't actually realize are going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was going to be my next question. There was, is it sort of like a major at school where when you join the Canadian Olympic Committee, you designate yourself of I'm focusing on whatever Olympic game or Winter Olympics, and that's sort of your area of focus, and you work with the same people, or as you were saying, is it more just a collaborative approach, and it's okay, what's the next one that's up? Okay, we're working on the Youth Olympic Games, and everyone diverts their attention to that. Then it goes to winter, then it goes to summer. Is it cyclical, or is it sort of declaring a major, like I was saying there?
So it depends on a couple things. With the big games, for sure, we have like a winter Olympic Games lead and a summer Olympic Games lead. And so with the postponement now in Beijing happening 6 months later, we've had a couple people that have now just been designated for the winter side of things, which doesn't usually happen from a regular games to a regular games. most people either tend to focus on one games at a time, or they do have that sort of split sectional stuff. But there are the departments like my own, when like I was talking about with qualification and registration with stuff, is we have to do that with athletes for every single game. So there are the youth Olympic games where sometimes it's registering 100 people or taking care of 100 athletes that might go, versus an Olympics where it is something like 700 people in total, but it does still take up time that can be spent working on the bigger games.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, we're still a few months away from really get. I mean, it's still winter outside right now, but still a few months away from actually trying out the 2021 now Tokyo Games. Has there been any talk or even preliminary discussions around, you know, testing or protocols or mask wearing or anything like that, or is it still so far in the preliminary stages that we have no idea what numbers will look like 4 days from now, let alone 4 months from now?
So with some of the stuff, obviously we don't know numbers. Like you were saying, Japan has put into place some different testing and different restrictions that they've been working out. So before, they've now re-shut down all of their different things because of the pandemic. They were testing different events in some of the Olympic venues with a certain amount of spectators and that sort of stuff, and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and security and that sort of stuff. But obviously, like, a decision won't be made on spectators, for example, until probably the end of March. So
Hmm.
some stuff is now, some stuff isn't. In terms of the Olympic Committee here in Canada, we have sort of started to plan out a sort of bubble idea with multiple different bubbles depending on where our people are staying. So the athletes and some of our staff and their staff in the village, and then outside the village that might have directly sort of that impact with them as well, and then sort of our other members of our staff that might not have face-to-face interaction with our athletes and staff at games. So basically, we've started to develop that, but like you were saying, with everything changing from week to week, the plan is sort of going to be ongoing until probably not that too long before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And would the thought process sort of be similar to what the NHL and the NBA did, where we're going to get everyone to the venues, whatever, 2 weeks ahead, quarantine them, test them daily, da da da. Then they're there, they're bubbled, they're safe, they're secure. Or is it more so going to be here at home in Canada? You would bring them sort of one central location and get them bubbled here, and then ensure that it's safe travel over. Has that been brought up, whether it's sort of a broad bubble or here bubble and then moving it, or is that again still up in the air at this point?
So it's been talked about on what they sort of want to do. I don't think you're going to see a 2 week bubble anywhere. And basically, each country is sort of going to have their own choice at this point, which is why we sort of plan for how are we going to keep ourselves safe from each other, but also from different countries potentially.
Hmm.
But the idea right now is that all of our team would be tested probably 3 to 4 days before we'd leave, and you wouldn't really go anywhere. And during that point, you take that flight over there. Basically, you'd get tested right when you get there again. Then you'd quarantine for 1 to 2 days, because at that point now, hopefully, you've tested negative all the way through. This is now a week. And then at that point, if you had to go in the village, you would get tested a third time by the organizing committee, and then 3 negative tests is what we think is sufficient enough to tell that someone doesn't have it, because our medical team is thinking that something like after 5 days after a negative test, if you have another negative test and it's still negative, then you're most likely okay.
Hmm.
But even with vaccinations, like, the IOC has come out as of right now and said that they're not going to force countries or athletes or whoever to vaccinate. So at this point, it's sort of been that bubble planning on how do we keep our team safe, as selfish as that sounds.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it brings up an interesting point as well too, because obviously, as an athlete, a huge part of the actual games is the athlete's village and staying there with all these other countries and interacting with people from different sports and backgrounds and all of that. Then I would assume that's probably going to look very different this year. Then, right? It would probably be Team Canada trying to keep all their Canadian athletes together and as much as they can, versus that Okay, well, free flowing activity between all these countries at a hotel or something like that. Like, is it going to be a fairly significant change to the athletes' village aspect then this year?
I have a feeling it will be, and the organizing committee has sort of started to set up somewhat of a COVID testing team and agency that's sort of trying to keep the virus under control in the village. I don't know how much is going to change in terms of operations. I think as of right now, stuff like the cafeteria is still going to be open. And so in a village, basically, you go at whatever time you want. You have the chance, they scan your accreditation, and you're just basically in a giant tent with whoever is there from any other country, and you get your food and you just eat it. And so I don't know how many changes will happen with that depending on the rises in cases coming up. But I know we're already trying to work on a plan for those pain point areas in terms of operation where we are trying to figure out if we're going to let people into that cafeteria or if we're going to have a team dealing with meals or how it's going to work. So it'll be interesting to see, but I don't think there have been too many huge operational changes as of right now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, you almost find yourself in a bit of a catch-22 in terms of your athletes and the testing process, right? Because you look at even what the NHL is doing, right? They're expanding rosters, anticipating that, at some point a couple people will probably test positive and need to sit out. But you know, when you're bringing people across international borders to Japan with all these other hundreds of other countries that are there, you don't want to be also bringing in all these extra bodies just in case, someone drops out. So how are you guys trying to sort of walk, I guess, that tightrope of you would never want to get in a case where, okay, well, crap, our entire wrestling team just had an outbreak. There go all of our wrestling spots. Do you have athletes waiting in the wing to sort of come over at the drop of a hat, or is it, well, too bad you tested positive, that's a gone spot, it's a forfeit type thing? Like, what's sort of the thinking for that at this stage of the game?
So it's different between team sports and individual sports. With the team sports, there is a team size that has to be followed, basically. So you don't have the choice of necessarily bringing over more. With some of the team sports, they do have alternate places that are traveling alternates that basically can come for the sake of injury or, in this case, illness. We usually have a couple alternates for those types of sports that might stay back in Canada as well, that if we need to fly someone over quickly, we can. With the individual sports, if that's your quota, for example, let's say you're playing tennis and you get COVID, basically either they try and postpone, which is going to be interesting to see how they postpone these different matches, or if they forfeit the person or what they end up doing. But basically, you're not allowed to just substitute that person with another one from your country. Basically, it would go to whoever's next in line under the top 50 or whatever that ended up qualifying. So it should be interesting to see. They're basically putting in a rule where athletes are only allowed to come 5 days before they compete for certain training camps, and they have to leave basically within 48 hours, which I think we're imposing within a 24-hour rule instead. So hopefully it'll be less cross contamination between sports and athletes, and it won't be as busy, like you say, in the village that it would be during a regular Olympic Games. But in terms of late athlete replacements, we do have a policy in place, and we do have the ability to just bring people over if needed, but obviously it's sort of a scramble when that happens.
Yeah, yeah. So depending on the sport, you might have some people with a packed suitcase just waiting for a phone call at home, or it could be a too bad so sad type situation then.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, again, you're bringing up all of these things that, as we're talking, I'm starting to think, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? Like, so for something like that, where they are coming over only a certain number of days before their event's scheduled to take place, within 48 hours, you got to get your butt out of here type thing. What are sort of the opening and closing ceremonies going to look like? Are they essentially just going to be just for show and for TV, and you're not going to have the big parade of nations sort of coming out there? Or is it just whoever happens to still have events going on during that time will be able to participate, I guess?
So I don't think they even really know at this point. I know there was news that came out today about the possibility of them limiting numbers of people that are marching.
Mhm.
Uh, but honestly, at this point, I think it's for the people back home to have that sense of pride with these ceremonies, and especially for the sponsors as well. Like Hudson's Bay is our clothing sponsor, so if they don't get that sort of that exposure from an opening ceremony, well, that's a huge loss there that I don't know if they'd be able to recover from in terms of the deal that's worked in. So
Yeah.
I think it's definitely going to happen for sure. Um, I don't know how many spectators will be there. I don't know if they'll line people up or what's going to work, because I was actually fortunate enough to walk in the opening ceremony for Lima Pan Am Games, which was last year.
Mhm.
Um, and that's a similar rule where you can only come 5 days before. You have to leave within 2 days after. So all the sports that compete in that second week aren't there that first week. So we have to fill some spots and make our team look bigger. But basically, you go through this pathway that's very intricate and keeps all the countries in order, but you're pretty crammed with everybody else. And so, in terms of COVID, I don't think that lead up trail can necessarily happen. So, it'll be interesting to see what they do on the back end side of things. And from TV, you'll never even know the difference, probably, but it'll be interesting to see how they adapt to that.
Yeah, yeah. So it might just be a flag bearer and then someone carrying a giant Hudson's Bay banner walking right behind them then, and that's all that they can send out there.
Maybe we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, again, given the fact that there has at least been some return to play success at the major league level, whether it's in NFL, NBA, NHL, and I mean, some leagues have been a little bit more successful than others, but does the fact that they have been able to award a Stanley Cup that were, in the conference championships for football now, does that at least give you guys on the Olympic Committee some hope that, it's going to be weird, it's going to be different, but at the end of the day, we think we can really pull this off now? Does that sort of helped buoy your spirits a little bit?
I think it does for sure, because you look at these leagues that are not only, I guess, big in terms of the people that watch them, but some of these teams, like you said, with the NHL, including taking taxi squads, you still have a fair amount of people. They're doing something like over 1,000 tests on different athletes and coaches and whatever per day. So it's nice to see, especially what the NBA did with its sort of Disneyland end of season and playoffs last year, because that's similar to what an Olympic bubble and village type of thing would look like. So it is hopeful when you see stuff like that, to see that maybe we can pull it off too. So it is definitely reassuring, to say the least.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing. Well, you know what, Jeff? This has been phenomenal, and it's been really, really good to sort of dive into some of the questions that I'm sure a lot of our listeners have had, as far as, delaying a whole Olympic Games, whether it's, going to be actual viable to pull off this summer. And by the sounds of it, I think it's going to be a weird event, definitely unlike anything we've seen before. But at the end of the day, these athletes have been training their butts off for so long. It's going to be refreshing for them to have a chance to represent their country, have the chance to go out there and compete on the world's biggest stage. And, I think you guys are doing such a phenomenal job out there. But for anyone who's listening right now, and maybe it is a sports business grad or someone who's just always wanted to work in the sports industry and wants to learn more about your day-to-day work and wants to connect that way, where's the best place to find you or get more information about the COC?
I'd say LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me. Usually, if you look me up, people have had no problem finding me there. And as always, with a lot of these sport professionals, we're always willing to answer questions that people might have. We were once where you were, we thought the same thing at that point. And that's why, like, I even run a mentorship program for current grads and recent grads who are looking to get into the industry, because it's sort of helping to train the next generation that's coming in, and you understand how they feel because you've been there, right?
Yeah, yeah, amazing. So for those that are listening, hit him up on LinkedIn there. Jeff, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.